François Achille Bazaine was a French general and from 1864, a Marshal of France, who surrendered the last organized French army to the Prussians during the Franco-Prussian War. He was the first marshal who had started as a legionnaire and, like the great marshals of the First Empire, had risen from the ranks. During 4 decades of distinguished service under Louis-Philippe and then Napoleon III, he held every rank in the army from Fusilier to Marshal of France. He became renowned for his determination to lead from the front, for his impassive bearing under fire and for personal bravery verging on the foolhardy. He was sentenced to death by the government of the Third Republic for his surrender of the fortress city of Metz and his army of 180,000 men to the Prussians on the 27th of October 1870 during the Franco-Prussian War. This sentence was commuted to 20 years imprisonment in exile, from which he subsequently escaped. He eventually settled in Spain where, aged 77, he died alone and impoverished in 1888. To the Foreign Legion he remains a hero and to this day is honored as one of the bravest soldiers. Early life. François Achille Bazaine was born at Versailles, second son of Pierre-Dominique Bazaine, a mathematician and bridge architect and engineer who was responsible for, amongst others, the building of several bridges in St. Petersburg at the request of Tsar Alexander I. His father abandoned his family just prior to the birth of Achille, leaving it without financial support. He failed the entrance examination to the École Polytechnique. Instead, he enlisted in the French army as a private soldier in 1831, with a view to service in Algeria, where in 1833 he received a commission as sub-lieutenant in the Foreign Legion, it having been formed by Louis-Philippe in 1831. He rose rapidly through the ranks, through successful actions during the Foreign Legion campaign in Algeria and against the Carlists in Spain, where in 1835 he was cited for bravery and gallantry in action on several occasions and rewarded with the Cross of the Legion d'Honneur after only 4 years in the army. After serving a second campaign with the Foreign Legion in Spain in 1837–38, Bazaine returned to Algeria in 1839 and took part in the expeditions to Miliana, Tlemcen, Morocco and Sahara. He was mentioned as instrumental in the surrender of Abd el-Qadir. In 1844 he was promoted to major and then to lieutenant colonel in 1848 after 9 years' service in Algeria and Morocco, including several years heading France's Bureau Arabe as governor of Tlemcen. In 1850, he was promoted to full colonel and given command of the 1st Regiment of the Foreign Legion, based in North Africa. He married his first wife Maria Juana de la Soledad on the 12th of June 1852 at Versailles, Crimea and Italy. He was promoted to brigadier general at Gallipoli in 1854, en route to the Crimea, and led a brigade in the Crimean War. He fought several decisive actions at the Battle of the Alma in 1854 and during the Siege of Sebastopol, where he maintained his reputation and for which he was mentioned in dispatches on several occasions. The way in which he conducted the left wing of the French forces in the final Allied assault on Sebastopol on 8 September 1855, received acclaim of the highest order from the Allied commandant. He was subsequently promoted to Major General on the 22nd of September 1855 and selected from all the Allied generals to assume the governorship of Sebastopol. At 44, this made him the youngest general in the French army. In October 1855, Bazaine was chosen to give the coup de grace. With a mixed French and British force, he sailed to Kinburn at the mouth of the Dnieper to attack the remaining Russian forces to the north of Sebastopol. He led a daring landing and seized the naval fortress with a frontal assault, an action for which he received particular praise. General Bazaine Bazaine, who commands that portion of the French army now operating at the mouth of the Dnieper, may be cited as presenting one of the most brilliant examples of the achievement of military distinction in the modern day. At Sebastopol, on the 25th of June 1856, he was invested by the British Commander-in-Chief, Lord Gough, with the Order of the Bath, for his conspicuous contribution to the Allied campaign during the Crimean War. On his return to France in 1857, he was appointed Inspector General of the Army. In 1859, he commanded a division in the Franco-Sardinian campaign against Austrian forces in Lombardy. He was wounded by a shell splinter in the head on the 8th of June, during the action at the Battle of Melegnano. He recovered to play a conspicuous part in the Battle of Solferino, which he captured on the 24th of June 1859. Despite being wounded again and having his horse shot from under him, Mexico, he commanded with great distinction the 1st Division under General Faure in the Mexican expedition in 1862, where he pursued the war with great vigor and success, driving President Benito Juárez to the frontier. His decisive action was instrumental in the taking of the city of Puebla in 1863. In the same year, he was cited again for his bravery in the Battle of San Lorenzo, for which he was made Knight Grand Cross of the Legion of Honor on the 2nd of July 1863. On the 5th of September 1863, he was raised to Marshal of France by presidential decree and elected to the Senate. At the same time, he replaced Faure in supreme command. He personally commanded the siege of Oaxaca in February 1865, following which the Emperor Maximilian decorated him with the Médaille Militaire on the 28th of April 1865. Here, as in 1870, two of Bazaine's nephews, Adolphe and Albert Bazaine-He, served with their uncle as his aides-de-camp. The Marshal's African experience as a soldier and as an administrator stood him in good stead in dealing with the guerrilleros of the Juárez party, but he was less successful in his relations with Maximilian, with whose court the French headquarters was in constant strife. His enemies whispered that he aimed to depose Maximilian and get the throne of Mexico for himself, or that he aspired to play the part of a Bernadotte. His marriage to a rich Mexican lady, whose family were supporters of Juárez, still further complicated his relations with the unfortunate emperor, and when at the close of the American Civil War the United States sent a powerful war-trained army to the Mexican frontier, Napoleon III commanded Bazaine to withdraw French forces and return to France. Bazaine skillfully conducted the retreat and embarkation at Veracruz. On his return to Paris he was feted by the public. Bazaine took his seat in the Senate as a Marshal of France and was appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Guard in Paris. Franco-Prussian War. At the outbreak of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, Bazaine took field command of the French frontline forces of 3rd Corps of the Army of the Rhine near Metz. Now Marshals un désastre. It is clear even at this early stage that Bazaine was acutely aware of his army's shortcomings against the well-known speed and menacing efficiency of the Prussian military machine, evidenced by his remark to a friend whilst boarding the train from Paris to Metz, "Now Marshals un désastre." He had absorbed certain lessons that were to become a vital part of French military thought. From the story of Waterloo he had learned that a line of resolute men on the defensive could again and again break an enemy attack. From Mexico he had watched Lee's dashing Confederates lose a war despite the commander's brilliance in attack. He had also learned that dramatic sorties were invaluable in North Africa but were risky against European armies. Finally, Bazaine saw with misgivings the Prussian invention all-steel Krupp breech-loading gun, which was to shape the future of artillery on the battlefield. He concluded at this time that for France defensive war is better than offensive war. It is better, he said, to conduct operations systematically, as in the 17th century. Takes over as commander-in-chief from Napoleon III. Bazaine took no part in the earlier battles, but after the defeats of Marshal MacMahon's French forces at Worth and Marshal Canrobert's at Forbach, Napoleon III was swift to give Bazaine the title of commander-in-chief of the French army on 13 August 1870. At the time, Napoleon's choice was considered to be a wise one. It was widely believed by French politicians and soldiers alike that if anyone was capable of saving France from the Prussian onslaught, it was Notre Glorieux Bazaine. He was the only remaining Marshal of France not to have suffered defeat at the hands of Prussian forces in the early weeks of the war. However, being the youngest of the French marshals, Napoleon's choice was met with suspicion and jealousy by the older, socially superior marshals. Hence it was with reluctance that he took up the chief command, and his tenure became the central act in the tragedy of 1870. He found the army in retreat, ill-equipped and numerically at a great disadvantage, and the generals and officers discouraged and distrustful of one another. There was practically no chance of success. The question was one of extricating the army and the government from a disastrous adventure, and Bazaine's solution of it was to bring back his army to Metz. The day after assuming command of the army, on the 14th of August at Borny, he was badly wounded by a shell on the left shoulder, a fact which was to be excluded from his service roll presented at his court-martial in 1873. Spicheren. How far his inaction was the cause of the disaster of Spicheren is a matter of dispute. The best that can be said of his conduct is that the evil traditions of warfare on a small scale and the mania for taking up strong positions, common to the French generals of 1870, were in Bazaine's own case emphasized by his personal dislike for the schoolmaster, Frossard, later the Prince Imperial's tutor, now commander of the army corps posted at Spicheren. Frossard, himself the leader of the strong positions school, could only blame his own theories for the paralysis of the rest of the army, which left the corps at Spicheren to fight unsupported. Bazaine, indeed, when called upon for help, moved part of his corps forward, but only to take up strong positions, not to strike a blow on the battlefield. It seems to be clearly established that the charges of treason had as yet no foundation in fact, nor, indeed, can his unwillingness to leave the Moselle region, while there was yet time to slip past the advancing enemy, be considered even as proof of special incompetence. The resolution to stay in the neighborhood of Metz was based on the knowledge that if the slow-moving French army ventured far out it would infallibly be headed off and brought to battle in the open by superior numbers, in strong positions close to his stronghold. However, Bazaine hoped that he could inflict damaging repulses and heavy slaughter on the ardent Germans, and in the main the result justified the expectation. The scheme was creditable, and even heroic, but the execution throughout all ranks, from the marshal to the battalion commanders, fell far short of the idea. The minutely cautious methods of movement, which Algerian experience had evolved, suitable enough for small African desert columns, which were liable to surprise rushes and ambushes, reduced the mobility of a large army, which had favorable marching conditions, to 5 miles a day as against the enemy's rate of 15. When, before he had finally decided to stay in Metz, Bazaine attempted half-heartedly to begin a retreat on Verdun. The staff work and organization of the movement over the Moselle was so ineffective that when the German staff calculated that Bazaine was nearing Verdun, the French had in reality barely got their artillery and baggage trains through the town of Metz. Even on the battlefield the marshal forbade the general staff to appear and conducted the fighting by means of his personal orderly officers. Marshal Latour, after the cumbrous army had passed through Metz, it encountered an isolated corps of the enemy near the village of Latour, which was commanded by the brilliant leader Constantin von Alvensleben, and promptly attacked the French. At almost every moment of the day, victory was in Bazaine's hands. Two corps of the Germans fought all day for bare existence, but Bazaine had no confidence in his generals or his troops, and contented himself with inflicting severe losses on the most aggressive portions of the German army. Gravelotte. 2 days later, while the French actually retreated on Metz, the masses of the Germans gathered in front of Bazaine's army at Gravelotte, intercepting his communication with the interior of France. This Bazaine expected, and feeling certain that the Germans would sooner or later attack him in his chosen position, he made no attempt to interfere with the concentration. The great battle was fought, and having inflicted severe punishment on his assailants, Bazaine fell back within the entrenched camp of Metz. But although he made no appeals for help, public opinion, alarmed and excited, condemned the only remaining army of France, Marshal MacMahon's army of Chalons, to rescue Bazaine at all costs. Napoleon III, unable to sit on a horse, his face rouged, followed close behind MacMahon's doomed army in a carriage. When on the 2nd of September 1870, MacMahon blundered into a German trap at Sedan, the Emperor mounted a horse despite his pain, rode along the firing line for hours seeking death. It never found him. At last, muttering that they must stop the guns, that they must cease firing, that there must be no more bloodshed, Napoleon III surrendered with 80,000 men. With Sedan, the Second Empire collapsed, Napoleon III being taken as a prisoner of war. Up to this point, Bazaine had served his country perhaps as well as circumstances allowed, and certainly with enough skill and of sufficient measure of success to justify his appointment. His experience, wide as it was, had not fitted him for the command of a large army in a delicate position. Since the start of the war, Bazaine appeared to lack the appetite for the fight which had been his trademark in his military career to date. This, although imperceptible on the field of battle because his reputation for impassive bearing under fire was beyond question, was only too obvious in the staff offices, where the work of maneuvering the army and framing plans and orders was chiefly done. In spite of this, it cannot be asserted that any of Bazaine's subordinates would have done better. Siege of Metz. The Prussian army of 200,000 men now besieged the city of Metz, where 3 French marshals, 50 generals, 135,000 men and 600 guns were encircled. Bazaine attempted to break the siege at Noiseville on the 31st of August, but the French were repulsed, losing 3,500 men in the attempt. There were supplies in Metz to last no more than a month, such that by early September the order was given for work horses to be slaughtered for food. By mid-September, cavalry horses also began to be slaughtered. Without cavalry and horses to pull the guns, Bazaine's ability to mount effective attempts to break out rapidly diminished. On the 7th of October, hungry and immobilized, Bazaine dispatched 2 40,000-man foraging parties along both banks of the Moselle, but the Prussian guns blew the French wagons off the road and the Prussian infantry cut swathes through the desperate French soldiers with chasseppots captured at Sedan. Over 2,000 men were lost in this operation. Typhus and smallpox was spreading, and by the 10th of October, it is estimated that 19,000 of the French troops in Metz were hospitalized. A further attempt was made to break the siege on the 18th of October at Bellevue, but again the French troops were repulsed, with the loss of 1,250 men. The city was on its knees, the troops and inhabitants on the point of starvation. diplomacy, then surrender. As commander of the only remaining organized army of France, Bazaine took it upon himself, perhaps justifiably, to control the country's destiny. He refused to recognize the new government of national defense, formed following the Paris revolt, and instead engaged in a series of diplomatic negotiations with the Prussian High Command and Empress Eugenie, who, with the Prince Imperial, had fled to Hastings, England. The purport of these negotiations still remain to some extent obscure, but it is beyond question that he proposed, with the permission of the Prussians, to employ his army in saving France from herself, perhaps to ignite a revolution against the government of Third Republic. When considered in light of the fact that Bazaine had long been a known Bonapartist, his actions were clearly designed to forge a way to restore the monarchy. The scheme, however, collapsed, and Bazaine surrendered the army of the Rhine, who became prisoners of war to the number of 180,000. This surrender is often explained by Bazaine's lack of motivation to defend a government that corresponded less and less to his political ideals and the best interests of France, as he saw it. At the moment of the surrender, a week's further resistance would have enabled the levies of the National Defense Government to crush the weak forces of the Germans on the Loire and to relieve Paris. But the army of Prince Friedrich Karl of Prussia, set free from the siege of Metz by Bazaine's surrender, hurried up in time to check and to defeat the great effort at Orléans. Tried for treason and sentenced to death, the French nation could not rest with the thought that the military supremacy had been broken by the superiority of the Prusso-German armies. The defeats could have proceeded only from the treachery or incapacity of the leaders. To this national prejudice the new government decided to bow and to offer a sacrifice to the popular passion, and thus the world beheld the lamentable spectacle of the commanders who had surrendered the French fortresses to the enemy being subjected to a trial by court-martial under the presidency of Marshal Bailly de Liers. The majority of them were, on account of the proved incapacity or weakness, deprived of the military honors, at a moment when all had cause to reproach themselves and endeavor to raise up a new structure on the ruins of the past. Even Ulrich, the once celebrated commander of Strasbourg, whose name had been given to a street in Paris, was brought under the censure of the court-martial. But the chief blow fell upon the commander-in-chief, Marshal Bazaine, to whose treachery the whole misfortune of France was to be attributed. When Bazaine returned from captivity, aware that in his absence he had been put forward as a scapegoat by the new government of the Third Republic for France's defeat at the hands of the Prussians, he was keen to be given an opportunity to clear his name and put his version of events at the public. In 1872, Bazaine published his account of the events of 1870 in Larmes-During and formally requested and was granted a trial before a military court. For months he was retained a prisoner at Trianon Palace, Versailles, with his wife and two youngest children, while preparations were made for the great court-martial spectacle, which started the following year on the 6th of October 1873 under the presidency of the Duc d'Ormel in the gallery of Trianon Palace. For some time the Duke and his colleagues had been looking for a way out of the difficulty, by which they could save themselves, satisfy public clamor and yet avoid responsibility before history. Bazaine stated in his defense, "I have graven on my chest two words, honor et patrie. They have guided me for the whole of my military career. I have never failed that noble motto, no more at Metz than anywhere else during the 42 years that I have loyally served France. I swear it here, before Christ." Despite a vigorous defense of Bazaine's actions by Latour, and the presentation of a number of strong witness statements from his staff including Colonel Willett, the court found Bazaine guilty of negotiating agreeing with and capitulating to the enemy before doing all that was prescribed by duty and honor. It was clear even to the most partial observer that the verdict bore very little relation to the evidence. For example, the Marshal surrendered only after receiving letters recommending him to defer from his generals, but the presentation of these at the trial was ignored. I have read every word of the evidence and believe it to be the most malicious casuistry. A letter which Prince Frederick Charles wrote in Bazaine's favor only added to the wrath of the people, who cried aloud for his execution. The court sentenced Bazaine to degradation and death, and to pay the costs of the enormous trial, which was to leave the Marshal's young family penniless. Bazaine's reaction on being read the sentence of the court was, "It is my life you want, take it at once, let me be shot immediately, but preserve my family." Since the Revolution, only 2 French marshals have been condemned to death, nay, by Bourbon and Bazaine, by an Orleans. But, as though the judges themselves felt a twinge of conscience at the sentence, they immediately and unanimously signed a petition for executive clemency to the President of the Third Republic, Marshal MacMahon, although Bazaine refused to sign this petition himself. Imprisonment and Escape. MacMahon, who was a fellow Foreign Legion officer and had served in many campaigns alongside Bazaine, was visibly disgusted when he received the news of the court's decision and was incensed by their attempt to pass responsibility to him. The government wanted to banish Bazaine for life. MacMahon first proposed life imprisonment, though he softened and commuted the punishment of death to 20 years imprisonment and remitted the disgrace of the formalities of a military degradation. Bazaine wrote to thank his fellow legionnaire, though he added, tongue-in-cheek, that he might have let his feelings run away with him. It was an academic concession for a man nearing 63. Bazaine was incarcerated on the Isle Sainte Marguerite and treated rather as an exile than as a convict. During the night of the 10th of August 1874, using parcel ropes supplied by Angelo Hayter, and baggage straps which he knotted into a rope, the 63-year-old Marshal attached one end to his body and tied the other end to a gargoyle and climbed down the 300-foot cliffs to a boat which his wife had brought out from Cannes. They sailed to Genoa in Italy, and from the Bazaine came to London with his young family, where he stayed for a time with his Hayter relations.